War doesn't always come with sirens. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with no gunshots, no headlines, no declarations. Just border stones moved quietly, roads built where none existed, and soldiers staring at each other across frozen peaks, knowing the world isn't watching. What I'm about to tell you is not the story of a declared war. It's the story of a prolonged conflict between two of Asia's greatest civilizations, one rising through control, the other through restraint. And somewhere in between lies the cold, harsh battlefield of the Himalayas. I'm John Ellis, and in today's lecture on Global Eyes, we travel to the world's highest conflict zone, where India and China have been locked in a silent war for decades. A war that isn't over, a war that may never be over, and a war the world has misunderstood from the very beginning. When India won its independence in 1947, it inherited a fractured subcontinent, a bleeding partition, and something more dangerous than both: uncertain borders. The British Empire, in its rush to exit after 200 years of control, left behind sketches, not treaties. Maps drawn by surveyors who had never seen the mountains they marked, coordinate placed without diplomacy, names given to valleys the empire never controlled. India's northern frontier, particularly with Tibet and Xinjiang, was a bureaucratic legacy of imperial laziness, not a product of real geopolitical consensus. You see, the British had created what they called the McMahon Line in 1914, a boundary that stretched across the eastern Himalayas. It was agreed upon at the Simla Convention between British India and Tibet, but China never signed it. Why? Because China never recognized Tibet's independence. And Britain, for all its power, signed a border agreement with a region it technically didn't control. So when the British left in 1947, India believed the borders were settled. China? It believed they weren't even started. But here's where it gets more complex. At the time, Tibet was still functioning independently. It had its own government, its own troops, its own spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. And India, under Nehru, welcomed Tibet's autonomy. But in 1950, just 3 years after Indian independence, the People's Liberation Army of China marched into Tibet, and the world, still recovering from World War II, did nothing. India's border, which once touched a friendly Tibetan neighbor, now faced a communist regime with expansionist ambitions. And yet, India didn't respond with force. It responded with philosophy. Jawaharlal Nehru was a man of vision, a statesman who dreamed not just of rebuilding India, but of reimagining the world itself. He believed in non-alignment, in peaceful coexistence, in moral diplomacy. But in the case of China, Nehru's ideals met their match in Mao's realism. In 1954, Nehru signed a treaty with China, a now famous but flawed document called the Panchsheel Agreement. It laid out 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Among them, mutual respect for sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. Noble, yes, but also naive, especially in the face of a regime like Mao Zedong's. Just a few years after signing Panchsheel, China began building a road through the region of Aksai Chin, a high-altitude desert claimed by India, but sparsely populated and poorly patrolled. The road connected Tibet to Xinjiang, 2 restive provinces China sought to dominate, and India didn't even realize the road existed until 1957. By then, it was too late. When the discovery was made, India protested, but there was no action plan. Nehru, perhaps still clinging to the Panchsheel dream, said, "Not a blade of grass grows there." It was meant to downplay the region's importance, but in doing so, India undermined its own claim. China, meanwhile, saw that line as a green light. By 1959, the writing was on the wall. The Dalai Lama fled Tibet and entered India after China crushed a Tibetan uprising. China saw this as a provocation. India saw it as humanitarian protection. 2 worldviews, 1 map, a slow collision. Skirmishes began to increase. Patrols clashed in Ladakh. Soldiers stared each other down in Nifa, what is now Arunachal Pradesh. But Nehru believed diplomacy could prevail. And in doing so, he underestimated the Chinese strategy, which was built on deception. In public, China spoke of brotherhood, Hindi Chini, bye-bye. In secret, it was preparing for war. It's perhaps one of the most tragic chapters of modern Indian history. India extended its hand in friendship, and China used it to take the first swing. October 1962, the Himalayan air was already thin. What little remained of trust between India and China disappeared overnight. On October 20th, without a formal declaration, without international warning, and without provocation that justified war, Chinese troops attacked Indian outposts across the Ladakh and Nepha frontiers. It was swift, coordinated, and brutal. The world was shocked. India was unprepared. And let me emphasize, this wasn't due to lack of courage. Indian soldiers fought with everything they had, on icy cliffs, in remote bunkers, with outdated rifles and no winter gear. It was leadership and logistics that failed them. In the West, the Cuban Missile Crisis was unfolding. The United States and Soviet Union were teetering on the edge of nuclear war. And while the world's eyes were fixed on the Caribbean, a second act of global betrayal unfolded quietly in the Himalayas. The Chinese PLA, better equipped and better coordinated, advanced rapidly. In Ladakh, they occupied the Galwan Valley, reaching positions deep inside Indian-claimed territory. In Nepha, they descended from the high mountains. Morale faltered. And yet, amidst that chaos, a few things became clear. Indian Jawans, despite inferior weapons and minimal support, fought with remarkable grit. Stories emerged later of soldiers holding their ground till the last bullet and then charging with bayonets. In Parliament, Nehru faced immense pressure. His dream of Asian solidarity was shattered. His belief in diplomacy had been exploited. And then, almost as suddenly as it started, China declared a unilateral ceasefire on November 21st. They announced their withdrawal, but only from the Eastern Front. In the West, in Aksai Chin, they stayed, and they've stayed ever since. So what was this war really? A message. China wanted to show India and the world that the new Asia had only one leader, that land agreements, historical maps, and moral high ground meant nothing. The result? Over 1,300 Indian soldiers killed, nearly 4,000 captured, a deep wound in India's military and diplomatic psyche. But perhaps most importantly, India woke up. A nation of idealists realized that realpolitik wasn't optional. And from that point on, the India-China border would become the most tension-filled, high-altitude front in the world, one where battles would be fought silently, and sometimes without bullets. You can tell a lot about global alliances by how nations react in moments of betrayal. When China invaded India in 1962, many of India's so-called partners paused. Let's begin with the Soviet Union. The USSR had traditionally been friendly toward India, particularly through Nehru's non-alignment policies. But during the initial phase of the conflict, the Soviets were balancing a much bigger diplomatic act, their alliance with China, and their indirect tensions with the United States. Moscow remained largely silent. It didn't condemn China. It didn't support India either. It watched as India bled. The United States surprisingly did more. John F. Kennedy, facing his own crisis in Cuba, still approved military aid to India. Not boots on the ground, but equipment, weapons, radios, supplies. India, for the first time since independence, was accepting military help from a superpower. It wasn't idealism anymore, it was survival. But make no mistake, this wasn't charity. The United States saw a rising China as a threat. Supporting India was strategic. It helped contain Beijing's ambitions. And yet, as soon as China declared a ceasefire, the aid evaporated, and so did Washington's urgency. Britain, the former colonial ruler of India, offered sympathy, but little else. Most European powers treated the war as a regional disturbance, not realizing it was a tectonic shift in the future of Asia. So what does this tell us? That in 1962, India stood alone, alone in the mountains, alone in the world stage, alone with only its soldiers and its sovereignty. When skirmishes erupted again in Doctrine, 2017, and Galwan, 2020, the global response shifted dramatically. The United States now refers to India as a critical partner in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad Alliance, with the US, Japan, Australia, and India, meets regularly. India has signed logistics sharing agreements with multiple nations, including France and Australia. India conducts joint military exercises with Europe, ASEAN, and even African partners. So the next time China makes a move in the Himalayas, it's not just India watching. It's the world. After the 1962 war, the guns fell silent. But make no mistake, the war never ended. It just changed form. What followed was a decades-long standoff, fought not with tanks, but with tents. Not with bombs, but with border posts. A Cold War. In the coldest place on Earth. In the 1970s and 80s, India slowly began to rebuild its mountain warfare capabilities. It restructured the army, created specialized high-altitude units, began building roads, landing strips, and weather stations along the border. Then came 1986, the flashpoint known as the Sumdarong-Chu incident in Arunachal Pradesh. Chinese troops crossed into what India considered its territory and built a helipad. India responded with Operation Falcon, deploying thousands of troops to confront the incursion. The two sides faced off for nearly 9 months, but this time, India didn't back down. Eventually, China pulled back. There was no war, but it marked a new phase, one where India started saying, "Not an inch more." Throughout the 1990s, minor standoffs continued, often sparked by differing interpretations of the Line of Actual Control, or LAC. No formal border agreement existed, only maps, and those maps often contradicted one another. The irony? Even the maps weren't agreed upon. In 2003, something changed. India formally recognized Tibet as part of China, hoping to resolve long-standing tensions and open up trade. In return, it expected progress on the boundary issue. But as history would prove again, China saw that recognition not as a trade, but as a concession. It's during this time that China began making assertive moves in Arunachal Pradesh, repeatedly claiming the entire region as South Tibet, objecting to visits by Indian ministers and spiritual leaders, all while continuing to build roads, infrastructure, and air bases across the border in Tibet. India responded with restraint, but also with resilience. The Indian Army didn't retaliate offensively, but it fortified its forward positions. Posts were manned year-round, helicopters were deployed to the highest peaks, and Indian diplomacy continued to push for peace with preparedness. The standoff between India and China was no longer just military. It had become psychological, a contest of nerves, a test of endurance, one where every tent pitched, every flag hoisted, every supply drop became a... In 2014, India elected a new leader. Narendra Modi, a man often seen as pragmatic, decisive, and unapologetically assertive when it came to national security. For decades, India's posture at the border was largely defensive. It sought peace, it avoided escalation, but the Modi era would redefine that approach. Let me be clear, India under Modi did not abandon diplomacy. It doubled down on deterrence. And deterrence, unlike defense, is a signal. A statement that says, "We don't seek conflict, but we are ready for it." The first visible shift? Infrastructure. For decades, China had built roads, tunnels, and airfields in Tibet, giving it unmatched mobility in case of a conflict. India, fearing escalation, had neglected border connectivity, but Modi reversed that. Massive funding was allocated to the Border Roads Organization, BRO. Roads like the DSDBO road were fast-tracked, a 255-kilometer stretch connecting Daulat Beg Oldi to the rest of Ladakh. This road, hugging the LAC, was a game-changer. For the first time, India could move troops and supplies quickly in one of the most contested zones. Beyond roads, India built advanced landing grounds, ALGs, in Arunachal and Ladakh, new bridges, including the strategic Darbuk-Shiok Bridge, forward bases with heated shelters, modern armories, and satellite comms, all-weather surveillance posts with drones and radars. But the transformation wasn't just physical. It was doctrinal. In 2015, the Indian Army began a re-evaluation of its rules of engagement. Commanders were empowered to respond proportionately. The era of taking hits and then filing protests was over. India also reorganized its military command structures. The creation of the Chief of Defense Staff, CDS post in 2020, marked a move toward integrated warfighting capability. Special forces units were redeployed along the Eastern Front. Air bases like Leh, Tezpur, and Hazamara were upgraded for quick mobilization. Diplomatically, India deepened its ties with like-minded partners. It revived the Quad, signed LAMOA with the U.S., Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, and conducted Malabar naval exercises. These weren't just military moves, they were messages. That India was no longer a reactive player. It was a prepared power. But the biggest test of this new posture was yet to come, and it would come in the form of Galwan. June 15, 2020, in the icy stillness of the Galwan Valley, 14,000 feet above sea level, a war was fought without bullets. In an age of satellites and drones, tanks and cruise missiles, this battle was raw, physical, and ancient in its brutality. Indian and Chinese soldiers, armed with iron rods, nail-studded clubs, and bare hands, clashed for 6 hours in the freezing darkness. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a message, one that China tried to send. But China for months denied any losses. Later it acknowledged 4, but intelligence reports suggest it was much higher. Here's what made Galwan different from every standoff before it. It was the first fatal conflict between India and China in 45 years. It showed that India was not just holding lines, it was holding ground. And it marked a public psychological rupture in the Indian mind. The government responded immediately. High-level talks began. Troop deployment along the LAC was massively increased. Airfields went on combat readiness. And India began building not just roads, but resilience. Within weeks, India had sent tens of thousands of troops to high-altitude positions across eastern Ladakh. Tanks were airlifted. Helicopters patrolled daily. The winter of 2020-21 became one of the harshest troop deployments ever seen in peacetime. But the battle wasn't just on land. India also banned over 200 Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat, citing national security. Economic disengagement began. Chinese investments were re-evaluated. Border infrastructure was given emergency powers. Yet India didn't escalate recklessly. There was no airstrike, no invasion. There was restraint with readiness. And here's the outcome. China, despite all its posturing, was forced into military-level talks over 18 rounds of dialogue. Disengagements happened at some key friction points, but the trust was gone. Galwan was not the beginning of a new war. It was the end of an illusion. The illusion that dialogue alone could secure peace, that shared trade meant shared trust, that brotherhood couldn't be betrayed. Let me ask you this. When China tried to redraw the Himalayan lines with brute force, who stood with India? For decades, India had been seen as a cautious power. Strategic, yes. Moral, certainly, but often alone. Galwan changed that. It reminded the world that if China could test India, it could test anyone. The United States, already rethinking its China policy post-Hong Kong and Taiwan tensions, took notice. For the first time in decades, U.S. statements used unambiguous language, aggressive behavior, unjustified Chinese claims. India has the right to defend its sovereignty. Behind the scenes, defense cooperation surged. India signed BECA, the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, giving it access to U.S. satellite imagery and real-time intelligence. Joint naval drills intensified in the Indian Ocean. Logistics agreements allowed Indian warships to refuel at American bases, and vice versa. Meanwhile, the Quad, the informal alliance of India, the U.S., Japan, and Australia, gained momentum. Once dismissed as a talk shop, it became a credible Indo-Pacific counterbalance. China began to panic. It accused the Quad of forming an Asian NATO. It objected to Indian participation in joint exercises. And it did something very revealing. It stopped talking about friendship. The Hindi-Chini bye-bye era was officially over. Europe too recalibrated. France conducted joint naval missions with India. The UK upgraded India's status in its Indo-Pacific strategy. Even ASEAN countries began seeing India as a stabilizer, not just a neighbor to China, but a necessary counterweight. You see, Galwan didn't just shake India, it shook the global chessboard. For the first time, India's border conflict became a global issue, not just a line dispute, but a test case for how democracies respond to authoritarian expansion. And in that test, India showed the world something crucial, that strength doesn't have to be loud, that power doesn't need to invade to defend, and that peace is not passive, it is protected. You may think the story ends here, that after disengagement talks and troop withdrawals, the border is peaceful again. But let me be very clear, this war isn't over. It's simply on pause. Because conflict doesn't always come with gunfire. Sometimes it's in the movement of tents, a satellite image showing a new Chinese road, a sudden objection to an Indian minister visiting Arunachal, a new Chinese village popping up in Bhutanese territory. China hasn't changed, it's just calculating, and India knows this. Which is why, even as negotiations continue, India is still building roads, still flying patrols, still running logistics simulations in the high Himalayas, still deploying troops, not temporarily, but permanently, in forward locations. This isn't posturing, this is post-trauma preparedness. Galwan was not a one-off, it was a revelation, and India is preparing for the long game. You see, India doesn't want war, it never has, but it's done pretending peace exists when it doesn't. India's patience is not weakness, it is strategic maturity. The ability to hold ground without giving in to provocation, the discipline to prepare without parading, and the wisdom to know that in high-altitude geopolitics, the biggest victory is not blinking. And if you think China is done testing India, just wait. New fronts are already emerging, cyber, maritime, diplomatic. But what's changed is this. Every time China makes a move, it must now ask a new question. Is India ready for it? And increasingly, the answer is yes. When historians look back on the 21st century, they will speak of superpowers, summits, and sanctions. But some of the most profound battles were fought in silence, on snow-covered ridgelines, beneath the shadows of prayer flags, in places with no headlines and no hashtags. India's conflict with China is not just a border issue. It is a civilizational test, a democracy facing down authoritarianism, a culture of tolerance facing a system of control, a nation that seeks peace, but no longer at the cost of its pride. For decades, the world underestimated India. It saw poverty, not progress, chaos, not resilience.